Hi, everyone. We're really excited to have our panel today. And I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about charting new routes leads to distinctive pathways. Water and land bind us, at the same time create massive distances between places. The space between us, or the Va, which is the Pacifica concept of where personal and cultural stories of identity through space and time represent a mapping of identity, the space between all things which defines us and makes us part of unity that is all. Mapping and charting the waterways is an opportunity to connect with new people, land, flora, and fauna, and for millennia, under the constellations of the night sky, we recognize the potential of the dreamlike state that can guide us to different islands across this great archipelago. The connections between the Pacific islands, Turtle Island, and the Circumpolar are complex, just as the geological regions of our continental waterways and land formations. The prairie landscape of the boreal forests, marshlands, and inland lakes imitates the never-ending ocean skylines that dominate the Pacific. Manitoba, or Manitowapi, is a place that illustrates the harshness and the beauty of life. Its name originates from the Cree words of Manitou, Great Spirit, and Wapo, Sacred Water. The Great Spirit echoes through this place where the Creator sat, the rock petriforms of Mantuapi, a powerful place of healing and knowledge. As I like to joke, Manitoba is the heart of Turtle Island, and it is the grounding force of the location of where the Creator chose to sit, because of its relationship to the intricate river systems that become a transmission lines of communication between land and water. I feel this magnetic force when I am drawn to moving through our river and lake systems to the Pacific and to the Circumpolar to build connections to the different landscapes and many other spaces. At the heart of this connection, this could be the fire that rests deep below the ocean, sparking the connection to our sacred fires on Turtle Island. Like moss, they're drawn to the light of the fire in the distant locations, forging bonds between knowledges and embodied practices. For me, since 2005, I found myself drawn to this fire underneath the water, traveling the 14,000 kilometers across the Pacific territories, embroiled in cultural exchanges of Indigenous knowledges and methodologies, such as learning by doing, intergenerational knowledge, mentorship, collaboration, and practice and land-based knowledge. These exchanges have been happening for as long as Indigenous people have been charting the stars to navigate new lands and bodies of water. Leading by example, as I was taught, I am embarking on a new 8-year project that will ask, can we transform public spaces such as university campuses, downtown cores, to forge new relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in Canada and internationally? With 31 partners from Canada, the United States, Hawaii, Alaska, Greenland, New Zealand, Finland, Australia, and Norway, our partnership is forged in sharing experiences of colonialism and the potential of transforming public space with digital and new media. This long-term Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council partnership will allow us to consider how we approach the differences and similarities in geographic and culturally specific Indigenous worldviews. Examples of the interwoven methodologies include learning by doing, learning through observation, creative intervention, resourcefulness, and inventive problem solving, and a respect for people that is linked to a broader worldview of respect for all beings. These are just a few methods and with the potential to develop new research creation in cultural collaboration. We've had the chance to develop new and exciting approaches to knowledge by understanding where different worldviews intersect, and this can deepen each other's understandings. Our group of researchers from the 31 partners and the 7 different countries consists of over 50 primarily BIPOC collaborators who are interested in how digital media and art create through innovative incubator labs, workshops, publications, exhibitions, and symposium, how we want to create new paradigms for community engagement in public spaces. Excited to share how this knowledge can benefit Indigenous and racialized people, especially youth, and what kind of decolonial tools can we use to build an Indigenous future within arts organizations and institutions that are grounded in colonial histories. We aim to create new models for institutions and cities to use to engage underrepresented members and underserved members of marginalized communities, leading to the creation of new knowledges advancing training opportunities, building capacity, higher BIPOC enrollment in education, and Indigenous cultural resurgence. We will investigate the role of Indigenous new media production in the project of decolonization and the advancement of new research and how to create self-sustaining projects that build on long-term capacity in underserved communities. We're excited to continue the long history of building connections between the Indigenous people of North America, the Circumpolar region, and the Pacific. Bringing together artists, scholars, and cultural workers from different disciplines and countries, we aim to fuel scholarship that is grounded in a confluence of Indigenous methodologies that are embodied in cultural knowledge and integrate theory and practice into these incubators, which will allow us to trace applications of digital and new media technologies such as robotics, AI, VR, new media, older media, and design. We're excited, or we're hopeful that we might have an event for March 2022, depending if the world allows us to do that. Our goals are to radically transform public spaces such as galleries, harbor fronts, museums, town squares, downtowns, and campuses that can create this new kind of community engagement in arts and creation for the broader public. This work requires relationship with community that is collaborative, reciprocal, and mutually beneficial. That is a partnership. This means, among other things, that we will co-construct new knowledge with each other rather than extracting knowledge from each other. And we will work with one another rather than observe the actions of the other. Just as the constellations chart our movements across the night sky, so does our relationship to place and time and space. Understanding the complex shared colonial histories of many large and small land masses across the archipelago will have great impact on our global practices in the future. Mapping out space for a future with strong BIPOC leaders in key positions in universities, galleries, and art institutions will carry forward a cultural resurgence that is forged in new practices and reciprocal relationships. The crisis that many organizations face is the challenge of planning for BIPOC leadership, because these spaces are not ready to give up their power and control to propose new opportunities for connection, creation, and new narratives led by BIPOC people. There's a great deal of work that must take place to transform these spaces, create vibrant vibrations with strong ripple effects among the different communities for long-term impact. The shift in reliance to the virtual and a COVID world makes the field of digital media ever so pressing, as we're talking to you via Zoom on a pre-recorded session for your conference. And this project is incredibly important for finding a way forward. A large part of this partnership is grounded in public art and exhibitions, and we look to this groundbreaking creative engagement with public art into the future. And we're excited that each time we meet, these exchanges bridges the waterways and land together to create new conditions for collaboration and reciprocity for past, present, and future generation of Indigenous and racialized makers, curators, and scholars in both hemispheres. Connections can be a catalyst for the radical transformation of place and create the conditions for social change. As we embark on this new voyage into the great oceans and rivers to be guided by the constellations lighting up the night sky. I'm really excited that we get to have this amazing group of scholars and professionals, and we're excited to talk a little bit about building connections between Indigenous people of North America, Circumpolar, and the Pacific. And without further ado, I want to introduce everybody. I'm Dr. Julie Nagum, and I'm a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts and Collaboration. Next is Dr. Heather Guillott, who's a Concordia Research Chair in Indigenous and Circumpolar Arts. And Dr. Johnson Witahara, co-founder of Apropos Creative Design Hub. Sakhalik Partridge, who's the Director of Nordic Lab. Dr. Leuli Estrella, who is a current curator and academic. And Dr. Lisa Ramna Finnbog, who is a doctoral research fellow at Oslo University. I thought it would be great if everybody gets an opportunity to kind of open and talk a little bit about where they're from and a little bit of context of their research. Who wants to go first?
I think the most recent doctor should have to go first.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay, yeah, so Yes. So I always introduce myself as a Sami scholar, basically because I sort of find everything. My work and my research is very much founded in my indigeneity as a Sami person. So Sami is the indigenous people of, well, our homelands are divided now by the nations of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. But we still have extensive, I mean, these are just borders on the maps, right? So we're still a community. And I think starting out, what I want to be very clear on is that the Sami community, like so many indigenous communities, is based on collectivity. So, and this is kind of when you go into Western academia or mainstream academia, it becomes very clear very immediately that coming from a society built on values of collectivity, it's very different in mainstream academia. First of all, knowledge is thought of as something that is individually owned. So you as a researcher discover things, you create knowledge, and that knowledge is then presented to the world as your creation. So coming from indigenous communities, that is a way of thinking that really doesn't, it doesn't work, because being a collective society, the knowledge that we create, we are very much aware of, is something that comes from collaboration, from the collectivity, from the values that are systems of governance, our judicial laws and our values and morals are governed by. And I think when I started my research, this was one of the great hurdles that I had to overcome to sort of get people to realize what it is I'm talking about. So I think, of course, you have the foundation of your research. And for me, that is basically museums and material culture and aesthetic practices. So that's what I do. But what's interesting to me is that after I submitted my dissertation, and also after I defended it, people immediately assumed that my dissertation was on methodology. Which is, it wasn't, I mean, yes, there was a huge the entire dissertation is very much centered in indigenous methodology, because it had to be for me to really do research that sort of contained or ensured that there was place and space for collectivity. But it's, going into this, this project and considering how our communities, despite being, divided by borders, divided by geography, place, we still have so much in common, and we're still, we're building these amazing bridges and these amazing connections. And at the core of that, I think we find collectivity. So if I would sum my work into like one word, that would be it: collectivity. I don't know if that is, I'm sure I'll get more into my research as we continue along, but I think that is a good way to start. So yeah, that's basically me and what I do.
I can go next because mine kind of follows what Lisa Ramna was saying. And so I'm Heather Guillott. I'm an Inuk from Nunatsiavut. My father's an Inuk and my mom's a Newfoundlander. And I'm currently an associate professor and university research chair at Concordia University in Montreal, or Jojage, where I'm coming to you from today, or in the past for the future, for when this gets played. And I really, really resonate with what Lisa Ravna's been saying. I've been a curator for 16 years as well. And a lot of my scholarly work relates to my sort of critical museology and curatorial studies practice as well. And so for me, that really resonates, because when I started out, my first major project was working on my own community, writing the 400 plus years of Nunatsiavut art history. I mean, it actually goes back thousands of years, but like focusing on, 400 and then maybe about 80 years. And so I started with that as the sort of grounding part of my own research, and it resulted in a huge community show, which then became a nationally touring exhibition. And then following that, I was also working on an event called Inuit Blanche that I founded with one of my colleagues, which was a circumpolar, maybe the world's first circumpolar night festival. It took place one night in St. John's, Newfoundland at the beginning of a Inuit Studies conference. And for that evening, we took over the downtown St. John's, and we had 25 different venues with circumpolar Inuit artists. So people from the Inuit family, artists who are Inupiaq and Inupiat and Yupik and all the way to Greenland and all throughout Inuit Unangat or Inuit Nunat from no one from Siberia, but everyone from Alaska straight through to Greenland, basically. And that project really taught me a lot about the synergy and connection and continuity of our culture across are just the sort of nation state borders that were imposed upon us. And then most recently, a couple of years ago, I curated an exhibition with two of my two graduate students that I'm working with, Carissa von Haringa and Amy Prouty, among all these tundras, of which Takralik is one of the artists as well, on top of her many other titles and hats that she wears. And that exhibition brought together circumpolar Inuit artists as well as circumpolar Sami artists. And so bringing together artists from all of these different quote unquote nations, but really Indigenous peoples around a land that shares a lot of commonality in the landscape and the flora and fauna and the way that we live and are in harmony with our environment. And it has really just been teaching me so much about how it is a land and not nation that really defines us as people. And I think the direction that we are going in as Indigenous people. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this project because it really helps me to continue to expand on my knowledge of our lands, but also of I would say the water and the ice that sort of unites us all at during various seasons. And so it's been really incredible to get to work with all of you.
Unmuted. Apologies. I thought I'll jump in next. Kia ora Heather, kia ora koutou. Ko Johnson Witihira toku ingoa. My name's Johnson Witihira. On my mother's side, I'm Yati Hinukura and Tamahaki. And on my father's side, my tribal affiliations are Ngāpuhi and Ngaitu Te Auru. I also have some Scottish, English, and some Samoan heritage in there too. So I'm a real good Pacific mix down here. I think I can sum up my work pretty briefly these days after being on some of these panels. I'm an artist, designer, and academic. I like to be in all spaces. I think I'm unusual in that I do serious academic writing, and I have done teaching within academic institutions. But at the same time, I'm also an artist as a practitioner and also a designer. Just a bit selfish. I need to be everywhere at the same time. But my philosophy, I guess, and my approach to what I do for the last 10 years has been very focused on how we can transform the spaces that we live in a way that we feel our culture in them. Growing up in New Zealand, it was like, I always described it as being in the matrix, feeling like there was something wrong, realizing that when I looked back at my family photos, the only thing that was Māori in those photos was the people. And knowing that over not that long ago, when we looked at how my people live, how our Māori people lived, everything in our world was created by us. Our homes, our clothes, our architecture, our vehicles, everything was designed by us. And now the world that we live in is fully saturated by objects and materials and things that aren't created by us. So they don't reflect our culture back to us. And in many ways, it's like being dropped on another planet as an Indigenous person and wondering and struggling to see yourself in those things. So yeah, in short, as a designer, my philosophy is how can I change everything? And I mean everything from the chair I'm sitting on to the typefaces that we use, to the products that we use in everyday life. And I think a big part of that is, as a designer, bringing your ego right down, realizing that, yes, the big art and design projects make you feel really good. You get lots of praise or you get a big opening, but it's the things I think that in our people's lives every day that really matter. It's the small things, the small design interventions where we can bring our culture in, starting to feel are a lot more critical, and they're not the things that you get praised for, but they're the things that we touch and see every day. So nō reira tēnā koutou, that's me. Nice to be on this panel.
Talafalava and Wurda in the Eastern Aranda language. I'm tuning in from Mbandwa, or the settler town of Alice Springs, right in the center of Australia, the heartbeat of the nation as well. And I've been here for a little while, and I work as maybe I'll start. I come from the Samatafa clan and the Piliae Fa'asea clan of the villages of Apia, Lelumuenga, Si'umu, and Salalulonga in the western part of the Samoan archipelago. Also have some German, English, Cantonese, Marshallese, and Persian heritage. And grew up in Australia and in Samoa, and work between Canada and Australia primarily through research creation and curatorial projects, publication projects, and as an artist as well. And very, very thrilled to be part of this panel and to continue this adventure of this research partnership over the many years to come and the years to date, in arriving at this point of connection and, you know, continuing to strengthen our bonds despite the distances and despite not being able to physically gather. And I think working collaboratively with other curators, as I did in the collective called the Visiting Curators. We worked on 3 projects in Brisbane, in Auckland, and in Vancouver over a 2.5-year period. And it made me want to never work alone as a curator ever again. It was so great when someone was really going through something for the rest of the team to just pick everything up. And we, you know, would shift hats in different locations, and depending on what was going on in our lives, we spent a lot of time on Skype because it was a pre-Zoom era, and that was a really beautiful learning curve, and I think has gone into other publication and curatorial projects that I've worked on. And then as an artist, I'm not interested in working alone. I'd rather work with my own community from Samoan Islands, but also many other communities from across the Great Ocean and Turtle Island and further afield, to really kind of, I think there's strength in the solidarity between us and in highlighting particular experiences. Also, you know, there's perhaps a song is missing from where I'm from, but that song or a similar song exists further across the ocean, which is a highway up until the 1800s when in the similar scramble for Africa, the scramble for dividing up the Pacific, demarcated all of these zones as the confetti of different empires from Japan through to Germany, etc. But really, we have, I think, particularly in the modern era, with planes and internet, etc., we have really rekindled some of these connections and forged new ones. So I think a big part of, I'm really also concerned with archiving the exhibition histories or the histories of visuality from different communities, particularly as so many of our homelands and across the region are either currently threatened by rising sea levels or drought, or are yet to experience, but we can kind of see the signs of possible future unlivability. So that the kind of duty to store and to somehow make the storage of cultural memory not a static thing, something that can be interacted with and that can transmit in really dynamic ways. That's something I've been thinking about a lot, and that I thought about and worked on a little bit during my postdoctoral fellowship at Concordia University, where Heather is as well. Yeah, so I'll probably stop there, but really lovely to be with you all.
My name is Sakhalik Partridge. I'm originally from Kuujjuaq, Nunavik, which is in what is known as Quebec, Canada. I'm currently on Algonquin Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa, and I work as the director of the Nordic Lab at SAW, which is an artist-run center in Ottawa. It's been around for a long time, and the Nordic Lab has just started work within the last year or so. So the idea behind the Nordic Lab was not, it wasn't me who designed it, but I came into the job with the idea of bringing together artists from circumpolar regions, circumpolar cultures, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to create new work and present, present new work with an emphasis on Indigenous-led, or at least equal Indigenous participation projects. So I'm not interested in projects that just have like a little bit of Indigenous spice, but are actually significantly conceived of by Indigenous creators. I'm also an artist and a writer. And in my work and also in my personal work, I'm interested in the ways that people form and maintain connections to community and to family and identity, regardless of where you are. Also connections to land when you are not necessarily in your Indigenous homeland. I've had conversations with Lisa Ramna about this, just feeling that how alive the land was in Sapmi, for example, and really having that experience kind of for the first time away from my homeland. And I think from that experience, just trying to translate that into how I relate to land wherever I may be. I'm also interested in seeing Inuit make a reasonable living and in people being able to pursue creative work and community work and I guess occupations that are fulfilling culturally and spiritually. I don't know if that's a word that we can use, but so I really liked what was mentioned about like thinking about little things. I think that those little interactions are something that to me are very important, like making sure that somebody gets paid for their time when they show up to XYZ thing, or making sure that I hire an Inuk graphic designer or an Indigenous editor or things like that. Those little kind of interactions that are the thing that creates like bigger change and bigger impact in our communities down the line.
Thanks, Sakhalik. I guess there's a couple of things I want to say. One is that sometimes when you're conceiving of a project, you don't realize how big it could be and how much geographic space it can actually take up over. And so it's interesting to think about from my perspective as we currently right now we've just finished building Abijibowan, which is a digital new media lab here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And in thinking about that, and I hope, Johnson and Heather, you guys will talk a little bit about the creation of some of those spaces in where you're working, and same for you, Sakhalik, because you're working in a physical lab. And so I think that it's interesting to think a little bit about, why and how it is that you do things, what are the driving factors, what does it mean to be Indigenous led and Indigenous designed, and so how does that impact the kind of results that end up happening, to go back to, Leiuli's comment of like, I never want to curate alone again. And I feel like, we'd be amiss to not mention Dr. Carla Taunton, who makes part of GLAM, and it's part of our success as me and Heather and Carla like to work together so much that, there's that kind of feeling of that kind of collaboration, but camaraderie, reciprocal exchange that ends up happening. And in essence, it's like, if we actually think about all of our kind of production, we don't do that alone, right? And I think a lot about my family and friends who really impact that work for me and have given me kind of like life lessons and experiential learning or embodied knowledge to be able to make me who I am today. And so I think a lot about that. I also think a lot about, you know, why is important to kind of destabilize the kind of individual authorship or ownership over some specific thing. You know, most of us who write and access material, specifically if we think about, you know, what academics do as publications, you know, there are usually lots of eyes that go onto that article that you finish writing, whether those be editors, copy editors, friends, colleagues, anybody that's willing to read it to give you feedback. And you realize that like it makes it so important to kind of think about how we do that work. And I think that, you know, partly what's exciting about our project is that it operates and works within kind of collective understandings and ways of being, at the same time being super respectful of the fact that we all have really distinctive geographic and cultural knowledge and information of our own regions. And I think that, you know, a lot of times there's kind of, there can be a kind of miss in how we define or understand. And even when I think about Manitoba, you know, we have 7 different nations that live in that, you know, well, I say small space, but actually it's quite large comparative to some of the other spaces where people are from. And so, you know, if I think about just that alone, you know, and how differently the interlag versus Southern Manitoba versus Northern Manitoba, how those different things interact and engage is very different. So then that's just within your own province, within your own country. And then, you know, there's over X amount of nations that live in that space. And so I think about, you know, how we work together becomes so critically important of how we want to be and operate in the world. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I would point out is that, you know, the project doesn't come out of nowhere and then we just invite all these partnerships and organizations to come join us. In fact, it's been a long, and we did a really nice kind of visual map of this kind of long history. And for me, you know, some of those working relationships almost span 20 years. And so I think that, you know, there's some organizations that we've just recently, you know, built stronger relationships over with the last couple of years. You know, there's others that have, you know, we've been in conversation with since 2015. There's others that are since 2010, you know, others since 2005. So I think that it's good to kind of think about how those kinds of relationships develop over long periods of time, and that there's kind of trust and reciprocity that's there for those people that are working together. So one of the questions I thought we could talk about is, you know, how does working collectively push against individual authorship and Western concepts of artistic scholarship, of artistic practice and scholarship? And then we can talk to, you know, some of the actual exhibitions and curatorial projects or design projects that we've done.
Well, first of all, I would say that a lot of people take credit for things as their own that are actually not working all by themselves. And there's lots of people that should be credited that aren't getting credited. And that's the sort of Western way of doing things. Like, you know, the idea of like the singular genius is, I think, probably not as prevalent as, you know, academia would lead you to believe, and that a lot of our work is being produced collectively, but with hidden labor by others. And so I think that a more honest and reflective way of being in the world is working through collaboration and acknowledging those people whose ideas you are in conversation with and in dialogue with, but also the people who are helping you do the work. And that's like you and I and Carla and like everyone else that we collaborate with. We try to bring in emerging scholars, not necessarily young scholars, but like emerging scholars and curators and artists, and to bring them, pair them together with mid-career and senior and elder artists, scholars, academics, thinkers, and creatives, because I think that as Indigenous peoples, it's really important that we build in that the collaboration be on many levels, and so that we're constantly learning from each other by mentoring and learning from those who have less experience in some areas, but who have lots of knowledge in other areas. And I think that's what keeps the work dynamic and fulfilling, is that we get to collaborate in that way. So I would say, yes, the collaboration is really critical. but also it's really critical that we keep bringing people in, and so that collaboration doesn't become, even when you have a collaboration, that can become not stagnant, but it can be sort of inward looking. And so I think it's really, really crucial to keep bringing in new voices.
I would just, like to pick up on that, because in 2017, I initiated an organization in Oslo, where I live. It's called Oslo Sami Deutsche, and it's basically an organization that focuses on Deutsche, which is translated by non-Sami to mean craft, which of course is a very is not a good translation. Let's just put it that way. So Deutsche is basically a Sami epistemology. So it's a way of interacting with the world, a way of learning and teaching that happens through aesthetic practices and storytelling. So the idea behind this organization was to create a safe space where Sami living in Oslo, which is, of course, that is, Sami living in diaspora within the city of Oslo, could come together and practice together collectively. And what we saw happening in those spaces was that people that had very little knowledge or practical, experience with Deutsche learned from those that had more, and then those that had more learned from teaching or from sort of giving, guiding those that didn't know. And together we sort of built a really nice foundation. And it turned out that although, we had a very specific intent with the organization, what happened was that we started collaborating on other things and other events. And so, for instance, when I curated an event that looked at the place of language and land in aesthetic practices, indigenous aesthetic practices, not only did Sakhalik come, which was amazing, and she was lovely, wonderful, but people from this organization also came in and help sort of get everything together, because I think it's really important that, when we talk about collectivity, that it's just not, collectivity and we work together and everything is, everything is beautiful. Collectivity is a way of life. It's a way of honoring and recognizing that you are never alone in your practices, and that you are never alone when you learn. So the knowledge that you produce comes because of these connections and relations that you have with other people and places. And I think in academia, in mainstream academia, and also for that matter in art, this isn't recognized. This isn't something that everything is about the individual, like the man that sort of goes forward alone, breaching unthread territory and just sort of discovering things. And that's just not the case. It's just not. And I think in indigenous communities, societies, we are much better at recognizing that, precisely because our society is built on the concept of collectivity. And a lot of the time you will see that within our languages, we have concepts and words that sort of specifically speak about that collective side of everything. So, yeah.
Lisa, Ramna, after I interviewed you for the podcast, I was like dreaming about Dolce, like all I could hear is like from the interview and conversation, and then reading the PhD, I just was like Dolce, 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 and then like all the complex understandings of it. So even when I hear you talk about it, I like smile, because I just like, it brings me back to this like really strong memory of trying to figure out. And I love how you articulate that it is so much bigger than a craft. It's actually an embodied practice. And I think that it's just like, there's so much complexity there.
Yeah, and I think, embodied practice, because the thing is that also in aesthetics, in art, what you see is that the artists that we have in our communities, they work through their body. So they reflect with their body, and then they create, they give voice to those embodied, whatever it is, and they create something that others can see. They visualize their embodied practices or knowledges or experiences or trauma or whatever it is. And they sort of give a voice to that, visualizing it so that we can see and so that we can share in those experiences. I think, going to exhibitions that are Indigenous versus exhibitions that are non-Indigenous, it will always be, for me, it's always a very different emotional experience, because I feel I can see myself in a lot of the artwork that I see coming from Indigenous communities, which again, I feel that a collectivity, which again points back to that collectivity, right? So yeah, and yeah, Doji is so much more, and aesthetic practice is so much more. So this definition of art is so constricting, because it kind of categorizes something that really shouldn't be categorized. You can't just, no one can put one definition, because it's not yours to decide alone. It's something that you negotiate in your community, if that makes sense.
Well, I've always been really interested in that idea of collectivity in terms of the production of art and how to express, especially in contemporary arts, in contrast to arts outside that space. Because when I was younger, I'd see so many of these artists, and I'd see their work, and I'd see them in an exhibition, and they talk about, and these are Indigenous artists, and they talk about the work. They may or may not talk about their family, others who supported them, but they wouldn't talk about engineers. They wouldn't talk about printers. They wouldn't talk about all these people who were there through the process. And I think it's within the contemporary art space, it's intuitively because it's counteractive to the goals inside that contemporary art space to acknowledge all those people. You're not meant to let them know that there was an engineer who made this beautiful thing for you off your scribbles. And it's always kind of bothered me in a way, and it contrasts really strongly with. So yesterday I just went to the opening of a new public artwork that I worked on with an Indigenous group in Auckland, Te Aki Taiwahua, and at that, where we created these public artworks, the Indigenous people, they acknowledged everyone, from the people who organised the project, this New Zealand Transport Agency, to the people on spades digging to help do the foundations, to the people who help create the artworks and manufacture them. These are done in concrete. And this is outside of a public space. And for them, it's really important that they acknowledge everyone, all these little people through these processes. And I've always felt this strange awkwardness going to a gallery myself, knowing that it's an illusion. And I think to talk about, at least to talk about Indigenous artists acknowledging collectivity in those contemporary art spaces, I think that's not going to happen, not in a really open way. I think, yes, we will acknowledge the collective way in which our art practice is made, but we're not going to acknowledge all the people along that path who really help create that artwork. And yeah, that's just, I guess, my thoughts on that. I think it's a little bit of a sticky area.
If I can add, the last time that Sakhalik and I were together was for Nirin, the 22nd Biennale of Sydney, with many others here, curated by Brooke Garu Andrew. And I worked on the largest installation I'd ever made as an artist, and had so many people who had contributed so much expertise and skill that it was unconscionable for me not to have a really long credit line. But it was rare. I learned that many of the other artists wouldn't put, who did the screen printing, who, I was like, but why do we put 16 funders and we don't put the 20 people who made this with you? They're the same cogs in the wheel to create something together, to embark on a project. So there's that kind of really fresh in my mind this week and going forward, as even just working collaboratively, or through this, there's a Samoan concept, soala pule, of deliberative consultation, where leaders are supposed to be able to be deposed and be held accountable when they stop being good leaders, which we haven't had, because we've had a dictator prime minister Samoa for 23 years, but that's about to change with the first woman prime minister. But that's also another situation, and I personally consider the Samoan governance system in the western part of the archipelago to be a banana republic, but we'll get to that another time. But I really was thinking about how how much I rely on my mother, Sona Naomi Ashragi, and artist Angela Titia and critic Lana Lopesi to discuss terms in Samoan, and with Leali Ifano Albert Refiti as well to discuss terms and sound out terms. And during my PhD, we kind of came up with a term for installation art, for curatorial practice, for sequential art histories. And then we're like, no, this doesn't really work. What about this term? Or really trying to not equate curator to manager, because it's not the same thing. You got to be like the visuality that's in service to the community, or find a different kind of expand existing terms. And so in the new media space, I've been looking at this idea of animated or digital barcloth, siapo viliata, rather than saying, oh, the camera is what's important. I think more the surface that tells these stories, that holds these stories, is important. And I wanted to talk about the sharing of, just raise the sharing of labor, the sharing of reward, the sharing of responsibility that we've all been talking about, and an exhibition that's due to open early June. Pasapijinawang, that John G. Hampton, the first Indigenous director of the Mackenzie Art Museum, Art Gallery in Regina, Saskatchewan, in neighboring province to Manitoba, who's from the Chickasaw Nation. Both of us have been members of the board of the Indigenous Curatorial Collective, Collectif des Commissaires Autochtones, since 2016. And I think naturally conversations build, momentum builds, and you're like, actually, let's just not be on a board together, let's do a project. And so we're really excited to open this show in a few weeks, which will go through till September, and bring in this constellation of our kin and our peers from all around the world, and thinking through these questions of the coloniality of languages and the way that different forms of colonialism shift language, English language, Indigenous languages, diasporic migrant languages. Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting, particularly with the pandemic, that a lot of the install has been done on Zoom, but we're, and I'm a Francophone, so we're gonna have a panel with the French-speaking artists, and then other skills, and particularly leading the institution lie in John's hands. So this, it's, I think, being fluid with where the hats are and just flipping them, and whose role is meant to be fulfilled at the time is very, it's a rare thing that we're very fortunate to practice in Indigenous communities around the world.
When you were talking now, I was just thinking we have this concept in, so my mother is South Sami and my father is from the, well, the dialect is North Sami, but it's, we call it Marka Same. So, well, anyway, so he speaks another dialect. But anyway, in my mother's language, there is this concept, which basically means a duty of care. And it kind of relates to how, or it translates to reciprocity in all my relations, right? So this is what we're talking about, a duty of care, that it's not just about honoring the collectivity of your community, but it's actually, you're actually morally obligated to do so, to recognize the people that help you on your path, like that. Even if, like, you never take your journey alone, so you may take it without people around you, but you still have someone there. There are still, relations and kin that help you on your path. And I think, I think that is, like, when you're curating, what you were saying earlier, Luli, about how you don't want to curate alone again. So it kind of feeds back into this. I know they have this a duty of care concepts in a lot of other Indigenous communities. And I think, I think this is something that, we really should open a discussion about within the international art scene, and put some responsibility to, generally to the art scene. And that's like, for instance, I often get, as I am one of the few Sami that work within museology in Oslo, or generally within on the Norwegian side of the border, I often get asked by museums, Norwegian museums, or Swedish museums, or art galleries to sort of come talk to them and like tell them how they can build an infrastructure that is kind to Indigenous people. And I'm just like, every time I'm like, well, I can come talk to you, but really you should just hire someone that is Sami, because it shouldn't be our responsibility to learn non-Indigenous people to indigenize spaces, making them safe for Indigenous or for BIPOC people. It should be about us going in and taking that space, right? Which, well, of course won't happen unless someone is willing to give space, which is a problem because a lot of the people that sit in these places today are not that eager to open space. But yeah, I think we have a lot to bring to those spaces, and I think a lot of that goes back to a duty of care and how we interact with one another, but also with our environment in general. Yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts? Like a duty of care?
I think I would expand that to the duty of care, you know, not only thinking about working internationally in this pandemic age where most of us are landlocked, if not region locked, and still bureaucracy might take 6 months for something to get paid. And the best advice I ever had was from your soprano, Deborah Cheatham, who a few years ago, when I was working for her at the Indigenous Arts Centre at one of the art schools in Melbourne, she was like, day one, go make best friends with the finance department, and then day two with the HR department. And it's really stuck with me because different jobs at different times in my life haven't had that approach. And, you know, Swedish bureaucracy is a nightmare. Hong Kong bureaucracy is a nightmare. It's a common human experience, and I would love for a decolonial future where we don't have any bureaucracy to go through. But that real, like, you know, really bringing the folks who process the money, who process the contracts into, like, in a really boring way, but actually not boring at all, bring them into the process and make sure that they are invited to all of the events. That was a really, and it's never really happened again in my career where there was an emphasis on that from Indigenous leadership, and it changed the results. You know, we got elders paid in far less time and artists paid in far less time. And so it was great. I also wanted to think about also wanted to say that, you know, duty of care can also be about caring for cultural memory. And I think artists, curators, writers, thinkers, makers, we're privileged in being abreast of multiple ways of thinking, and that, you know, meeting in this panel in English is already an intercultural experience, whether we speak our ancestral languages fluently or not, whether we can speculate our futures and theoretically project ourselves into different temporalities in those languages or not, they're infused in us. And so there's like a duty to enact these ancestral ways of relating and being. And I think through such research and through ceremony and through, you know, having wines at a bar, as some of us have done many times, these are really important what Kimberly Malton and I call kin constellations. So, you know, these are really important ways of creating new constellations or reinvigorating constellations that existed. And, you know, there's like a fungus that grows in Karukinka, in Tierra del Fuego, and also grows in Lutruwita in Tasmania. So there are signs in nature all around us in the environments that we belong to, of the relationships that are there or that can be there. So yeah, I guess I wanted to share that I think duty of care can also relate to standing up for a better vision of healthier communities as well. And sometimes that means going around about, you know, following the river and spending time on the other side of the place, as you were talking about Sakhalik living in Sapmi for a long time, and that kind of the different lessons that we can learn and then eventually bring home. And I think particularly Sarah Biscaragili taught me that sometimes diaspora happens a few generations later, that the knowledge needed to be learned in a certain place in time and then brought back at a certain place in time when things were, when people were ready to receive that knowledge.
You always speak so eloquently. About care, I mean, I don't use necessarily the same language. I guess I'm the only one here who's not an academic. But I can understand what you're saying about a duty of care. I think, like, for Inuit, something that I think about often is that we feel responsible for each other. And, you know, even when you're not physically with other Inuit, you can witness it on Facebook. One example is people care for other people or want to give to other people or want to make sure that other people are safe, even when they don't personally like them. Like, so-and-so is lost on the land. And like, there may have been some drama about blah, blah, blah recently or even before, but everybody is concentrated on like willing that person to be found. Everybody. And it doesn't matter if you've seen the drama before. It's like, there's like a responsibility there to take care of each other. And it's just reflected in so many of the activities that Inuit have, regardless of where they are, like in Montreal and Ottawa and in the bigger centers in so-called Canada, there's large Inuit communities. And of course, people are so connected and share food and share resources. Like, there's an idea in Inuit culture that you're not supposed to have too much. And like, it's like a crime if you have too much. And like, so that if you have more than you need, then you end up giving it away to other people. And this doesn't only mean other Inuit, but of course, you know, that's your community wherever you are. But I think it's something that can be brought into working relationships and that other people can learn from. When we're talking about, we were just talking about recognizing everybody who contributes to something. Like, my approach is when you're working in a group with people doing whatever, like, everybody has some kind of thing to contribute, and everybody, when they have a chance to talk, is equal. Like, it doesn't matter if they're the janitor or they're the whatever director of whatever place you're working at. Like, each person, when they have a chance to say something, then that has value. And that I think it's just a different way of sort of being in the world. And it's taken a while for me to like really think of that as something that's really valuable and maybe different than the way that things are supposedly supposed to go. I just said supposedly supposed to.
I was like, you're in good company. I call that the Julie Gooder Book of English. You don't worry about that. We're supposed to make up words, I thought. You know, I love how Leuli said that we actually like embody our language. It makes me feel a little bit better as I butcher each word that I have to learn how to say and, you know, awkwardly introduce people in different languages. I'd say because we're kind of like, we're not wrapping up, but we're going to go getting closer to the end. And so I think that everybody's working on some really incredible projects. And I'd say that like pieces of, so there's two I want to talk about, and then I know others will jump in and share. But the first one for me is Nui Blanche Toronto. And I'd say that for Nui, I'm their inaugural artistic director. And for those of you that don't know what Nuit Blanche is, in Toronto, it's the largest public exhibition in North America. And because of the pandemic, as we rushed home from Sydney, Australia, quite quickly, because in Canada we were told to, and I know in other places they were instructed to do the same. And when we got back, I kind of quickly learned that we weren't going to have an in-person event. Nuit Blanche draws 1.2 to 1.4 million people out into the public space. It's a 12-hour event that that is very much against all the things that COVID. It would very much be a space where COVID would thrive. Let's just say that. And so, so we moved to a totally virtual online platform, which was the first of its kind, and we had 55 BIPOC artists where. Johnson was one of those artists and will be hopefully in the physical space for 2022. And so, we had augmented reality, virtual reality, a live stream, podcasts, talks like the one we're doing, and put together a 14-year archive that had 1,451 works. Just to kind of give you some context of what that exhibition has done over time. And I think that what makes Nuit Blanche interesting is that it takes up public space and it draws on people that aren't used to coming to the White Cube. So a lot of people that go to that event have never been in a gallery or a museum, come out for the night to enjoy all of the art, and it takes up space in a new way. When you walk into the city streets, all of a sudden the way that we negotiate or the way that we move or think or be in the world, it gets shifted. And I think that, that in itself is pretty exciting. And we're moving to an entire 2022 event because we don't know what next falls will hold. And it sounds like maybe there's a fourth wave. I don't know. We'll see what ends up happening. Fingers crossed that that's not the case. But basically, based on the numbers and issues that are happening in Toronto right now, we've definitely made the decision to move everything to 2022. And I think that, it's one of the other big projects that I hope Heather will pick up on because, she's leading a huge chunk of this, but we co-chair the Indigenous Advisory Circle at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and we just opened Hamayuk, which is the world's largest and first Inuit art center. I don't know if that's actually, legitimate, but we definitely have the world's largest collection of Inuit art. And so one of the things that I'll say, and I'll pass it over, is that, the opportunity as a non-language speaker to work on naming, 7 different Indigenous languages. And of those 7, one of those is the 4 different dialects from Inuit Nunanga, which almost, and Takarlik was part of that naming process. For me, I was like, can you write it in the chat? Can you write it in the chat? Because everything sounded, there's just slight differences, and not just between dialects, but even, just hearing all the different languages from all the different language keepers. And I think what was really incredible is that we could have just offered ceremonial practice or protocols to each person to name a physical space. And because we named, I think, 14 different spaces, what in fact we did was actually a lot more collaborative. And so we worked with all these language keepers plus all the people that sit on the Indigenous Advisory Circle to talk through conceptual understandings and see where those languages could overlap in a conversation. And I think, or a conceptual framework. And I thought in some ways, it's just such a beautiful interplay of language and understanding of how that worked. And I think, like I said, it could have been easier just to ask a person, offer them something to name the space. But the kinds of, I'd say, highlight in terms of from the circle's perspective and from my personal perspective, like I said, as a non-language speaker, to get the opportunity to listen to all the words and ideas that people had to offer, and just to see the kind of critical conversation that ended up taking place between those different dialects and different nations. And, in the end, it's really quite beautiful. There's lots of words for the idea of sky. We worked in the concept within light and bringing light, or light never burns out, or, it's the dawn of the new light. And so there's lots of really beautiful ways of thinking about how our relatives were engaged, or how people would be walking into those physical spaces, or some of the histories that exist within that geographic spot of where the Winnipeg Art Gallery sits. So, I mean, I know Heather and Tak will have lots to say about this. So,
I mean, like when I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about how holistic this conversation is, because that was also like, that was a beautiful Indigenous process that brought together elders and language keepers from all over what is now the province of Manitoba and all across Inuit Unanga to speak together and find way, like that itself was beautiful. But it also reminds me about there's that incredible transformative process, but then there was all of the behind the scenes of pushing at administration in ways that they were uncomfortable with, and we had to bring them along. You know, the director, Stephen Boris, who has been incredible to work with, but still is, you know, like he would be the first to say that he was a white dude trained in a Western art history program who has had to like really learn and grow alongside of us. And you know, he came to us first and he said, like, give us like, go to the circle, get some Indigenous words, and I'll run it up to the board and we'll talk about like the ideal title for the building. And we were like, no, you can't do that. Like, we were like, this only goes in one direction. Either we contact a translator, you pick a word you like, and we pay someone to translate a term. But if we go to a circle and they give a name to this new building, that's the name. There's no talking to the mostly white board about whether or not that name is like accepted or not. Like, you have to, we can do it your way or we can do it our way, but there's no in-betweenness. There's no negotiating around what the Indigenous given name is and all the other names inside. And so he had to like take a day, but then
it was more than a day. It was a couple of weeks.
It was a little while. but because the institution, because he does represent the institution, because it was willing to be a little bit more flexible than it would normally be, and to take a bit of a chance and to say, okay, whatever you say, we're going to go with that, then it actually turned out to be this incredibly beautiful process, better than we could have even dreamed it was. But you need that, you know, it goes back to what Leuli and Lisa Ramna and Sakhalik were saying, is like, you need to go back to that place and push on boring administrative processes. You know, of course you have to run it by the board. You don't just accept, you know, this group of this advisory circle. You know, advisory circle is not a great name for what we are. You know, we don't really give advice. We say this is how it's got to be, and then they take it or leave it. You know, I don't know what the word for that is. It's not really advisory, but you know, whatever it is, that's what that process has been. And there's been lots of little things like that. And it is like, you know, it's that boring stuff of being like, well, we need to change the way that we process checks, because if an elder speaks that day, they expect to get the check in their hand or an EMT or something on that time. And if you don't do it that way, if you treat everyone like they're an academic or a professional and they can wait 3 months for their check to come in, that it doesn't just insult that person, it insults their whole community. It doesn't just insult, it doesn't just look bad on the person who is doing it. It looks bad on, doesn't just look bad on the institution, it looks bad on the Indigenous person who has brought that elder into the institution. And so, like, you know, we bring all of our relationships with us when we do these things. So like, a one-off thing is never a one-off thing. It actually, it has built on everything we've done, everyone we know all of our lives. And the blowback is on us as well. So we need those little administrative things to change in order to be able to do the like holistic, big dreaming kind of work.
Yeah. And I would just add that part for the, you know, that's been a big challenge in lots of institutions, you know, not just the gallery, but universities more broadly, and, you know, arts organizations as well. And, you know, lately you joked about like being friends with, like, go introduce yourself to HR and go make friends with the other areas. And it is really true, because you realize that not only are these existing structures, but they're people that work there that also, you know, like, I was so excited and so gung-ho when we did all the work at the gallery and the university, and I was like charging full steam ahead, you know, taking names and, you know, like just going quick, and then realizing that in fact, you know, when we had a big kind of conversation with the entire organization, there were lots of questions. And then you realize that in fact, the kind of day-to-day people that work there that end up being the frontline people end up, you know, those are the people you have to convince, you know, not necessarily the board of directors or even the director, you know, it's actually those day-to-day people that end up being the frontline workers that end up seeing everybody come into those physical spaces and greeting them, and security and education and volunteers. And I think that there's so much work to be done there. And every time you do a little bit of work, you know, it can unravel and go backwards, and then you have to do a little bit more. And I'd say that, you know, the fact that they were really trying to, you know, Stephen has really given us a lot of space, and has really listened to us when we talk. And so I think that, you know, in those ways, I feel like, you know, we wouldn't have been where we are, and we wouldn't have had the names that we had gotten with all of the incredible language keepers. And just like sometimes I dream about that conversation, you know, of all those different ideas and concepts and how people were building and getting excited off of each other. And I'd say, you know, it's pretty awesome.
Just going over back to what you were saying, Heather, around, I guess, those administrative processes. I know in a lot of the design projects and the spaces that we're in, working with Indigenous people, and particularly doing research, where we get research participants in, we want to, often we give them a koha, so it's kind of, you know, something to acknowledge their part in the research. And often these government organizations, they want them to be signed up as a contractor, or they want to, like you said, they need to have a name on the check, and we give them cash in an envelope. And we have to work really hard to make that happen. So no, this is the process. We just put this cash in the envelope. They come and participate, and we, you know, and we capture all that. But even little things like that are really, really big things when the system is so rigid and doesn't want to move or doesn't want to accept that we just need to do things in different ways to make it work for our people. And I think the naming thing is really interesting too. We're trying to name something again on a design project and bring an Indigenous name into it. Research was done without us at the first stage of it, and it was so racist that it had to be thrown out. We had to design a new process for the naming. Part of the reason was where the Indigenous names were presented for this project, the people presenting them were non-Indigenous Australian company, and they would say, here's some of the names, here's some of the English ones, here's some of the Māori ones, but isn't that word a bit hard to say? You know, I don't know about that. This is what they were actually saying to the research participants. So we had to can that, rewrite the process around naming. And I guess one of the important things that we had to iterate is when you went to an elder from one of our communities for a name, that there was a shared responsibility. I think in the Western perspective, they see it as, oh, this is a dogmatic Indigenous process. They've gone to the elder, and the elder has decided this is the name. And we had to really highlight the point that there's a risk from Indigenous communities when that elder gives a name to you, you have to uphold the mana, or you have to uphold the kind of the power and esteem of that community as an organization or as a product or whatever. And if you don't, it could be detrimental to that community. So it's not just a dogmatic, we're coming in, this is the name, you have to use it. It's actually, there's a shared responsibility. If your organization doesn't uphold our values, then it can come back to us. And we thought that was really important to, you know, to let people know that that's part of this naming process for us. And it's significant in terms of, I guess, why we go back to our elders to get those names.
Well, and I think it goes back to the idea of the direct translation. Like if you just want a word and you want that word and you want to pick whatever that is and you want it translated, well, we all know that even just going back to even Lisa's stuff around Toche, it's like translation doesn't work, in fact, you know, and I'd say that, you know, and so like if we think about that, you know, the ideas around translation is a struggle, because if it is just a word, you know, you don't get the conceptual framework. What are you going to say?
Can I give the examples that going back to our exact same naming one, and Takerlick's going to know what I'm laughing about here, but we were talking about early in that naming conversation, you know, Stephen was like trying to throw out words. We you know, that sort of stopped quickly, but in the beginning he was like, you know, what about, you know, like Winnipeg is the heart of Turtle Island. What about like heart? What about that kind of a word? And immediately one of the Inuit elders on the call. It's like, in Inuktitut, heart is not a metaphor for love or sex or anything. Like, it is just a beating, and I said, just a delicious organ. Like, it's not something, you cannot, like, if you call it the heart, like, people are just gonna, like, you might as well call it the spleen or the, you know, or the whatever else. And so, like, you really do need to be careful with that stuff. It is good to you know, to put your money into, to put the concrete action, invest in doing these right, because, you know, metaphors are not metaphors across languages necessarily, and so you do need to be careful with that stuff.
Yeah, I know in Māori it's funny, it's kind of similar. Like, it's nyako is described, it's not the heart, it's actually the stomach is described as the seat of emotions. And I guess, you know how you feel when those emotions are happening, so we use that different word to describe that, and not heart. And but to someone, if you're going to use stomach as the way to describe that, it's not as romantic, right?
It's the gut of everything.
Right,
The
Jeff.
Belly Center for Contemporary Art. I was thinking also that duty of care extends to the duty to uphold the integrity of the language in what you were talking about, Johnson. And like, I think it's important when companies from Australia, from other really racist settler colonial regimes, work in other contexts and probably have never done anti-racism training, you know, just the very bare minimum of cultural awareness, but nothing that really deceits the centrality of English, like the dissenters, how English is like, oh, we can get everything in translation. And, you know, name a mainstream art historian who's read Rancière in French. As a, you know, just to think about all of the French writers that a lot of Western art history is based on, but it's always in translation, and it's not like going in to tease the differences and the multiple meanings of a term in that language, which of course extends to many of our languages and all of the practices that come forward in artist work. And yeah, it's just there's a lot of dramas going on in Australia currently, and I think it's very interesting to think about naming, and I've been involved in a few processes that I can't talk about, but that yeah, basically the chair of the board will be like, oh, let's do this. And it's like, maybe you don't deserve an Indigenous language name yet. Maybe that's in 50 years. This is not where you think you're at. You actually have broken this AZ and, you know, 5 different protocols in this one conversation. And that's why, and last week as well, which is why a bunch of elders haven't come back. And, you know, like, just even recognizing that, I like to say that Samoans and other Indigenous peoples, we have a long memory, and can hold grudges for a long time, can heal, can change, but it's that longer memory that is also passed down. It's like, oh, my great-great-grandparent did this, and so such and such situation should be had. I think it's that, you know, it really is at odds with the kind of quick forgetting of Western culture, or, you know, at least in this consumerist way. It's not the basis of any human culture, but yeah, just thinking about duty. Oh yeah, and I also just wanted to mention that it's going to be announced shortly. By the time you watch this talk, I'm the curator for the Tarawara Museum of Art's Tarawara Biennial, which is a contemporary Australian art biennial in 2023. And although I am like the one curator on it, so not necessarily, you know, collaborating formally, I will definitely be collaborating with many folks. And I've already been doing research travel around Australia. And I think it's interesting to think about how, you know, I'm desperate to continue working on projects internationally and to continue to spend time with everybody. But the reframing the home space, I think, is also an interesting challenge of the restrictions around the pandemic, that we can be international, we can conceive of ourselves in constellation with everyone else, whilst sticking to your backyard kind of vibe. Yeah, so that'll be in 2023, so come through.
Can I also make a plug, as we're doing some plugs here? It's like one of the things that I'm really proud of that we've done this year is not just the opening of Comic Book, but the exhibition that I co-curated Inua, speaking of like bringing up other voices and bringing other people into the process, and what Sakhalik started with talking about, like providing meaningful opportunities for people to get paid to do interesting work in the arts and support other artists and so on. The exhibition that myself and Asiniak and Kabusiak and Krista Uliuk-Sawadsky co-curated, we, through the partnership grant that I direct, Inuit Futures in Arts Leadership, which Sakhalik is on the leadership team, all of the Igloolukti, the students that are on that project, all the post-secondary Inuit and Inuvialuit students all across this country who have been working on that this 7-year project with us, they also all contributed to the creation of an audio guide that is going to complement a 360 tour of the exhibition. So that's all going to launch by the time that this is airing. That will be live, so you can go to wag.ca and check it out and get to listen to all of the reactions and stories and engagements that all of these amazing people had with the works in the exhibition. They're not just like art historical, although many of them are. They are also like personal. Some of them are really funny. There's like some that are really musical. They're fantastic. I hope you all go check it out. Like me.
So I'm not going to go right into plugging exhibitions and stuff, but what I wanted to say just very briefly when you talked about languages, that we have to keep in mind, at least, I mean, this is at least the case in Sami community, that literature as defined by a Western society is not something that, you know, in Sami communities, what we've had is oral. Stories, like storytelling, stories, but also practices and objects and things. And that means that the word is very much, there is so much power in the word, not only with thoughts to concept, but also what you were saying about how you name things. It has a lot more power behind it than when you speak in English. I mean, in many places in Sápmi, there is still, you know, the written word isn't really given as much authority as the spoken word. So that, what I mean to say is that when you have an agreement with someone, you know, you agree to do something, instead of writing a contract, you have a verbal agreement, and that, you know, has more strength to it than a contract would have. And I think that's important to keep in mind with language, that there is so much, it's not the word, but it's everything connected to the word, and it's also the practices connected to that word. So, and I mean, I think when we talk about curating exhibitions, this is really important to keep in mind, that, you know, you're not just setting up an exhibition and that's that. You're creating a frame that has to resonate with the artist, but also with the communities those artists come from. I mean, for instance, I'm like, as you know, I'm one of the co-curators at the Sam Pavilion next year in the Venice Biennale. And we've had these conversations about language, right? How important it is to honor the language, because in the language, you have the vision. I don't know how to put it in a way that sort of gets across strongly enough, but yeah, we are the language and the language is us. So when we speak the language and when we put our words onto things and structures, that means a lot more than just a simple translation. It's you know, in a way we are making kin of it. We are taking it into our communities, making it a part of ourselves. And that, I think, is something that we should, I think maybe we should be better at conveying this when we work with non-Indigenous people, that listen, what we're talking about is really this. You don't understand what we're really talking about, so I'm going to explain it to you. I think that's really important. Just my thoughts on language. Also, plugging, please do come to Venice and look at the amazing exhibition that will have some of the most amazing Sami artists. So, yeah.
I'm not going to plug anything right now. I'm just going to say thank you.
I'll say, I think we all can't wait to travel to go see art again. Like that is the thing I'm most looking forward to. And I suspect that Venice might be the first thing that we get to do together. So I hope to see you all there.
I mean, yes, art and all is great. I'm just looking forward to seeing people, like people, and knowing that life continues. It's, yeah. But we'll get there eventually, I hope. And yeah.
I think we can say thanks and for everybody joining us and coming along on the ride. Any other final thoughts, or anybody want to jump in to say anything?
Too many thoughts. I've written a lot of post-its while we've been talking about all the things I want to talk about. But yeah, I just think, you know, one of the key themes that I enjoyed in this conversation today was the one around collectivity, and also the one around duty of care. And I think just the thing I wanted to end it in terms of duty of care for me was around duty of care in terms of how we look after our knowledges, and the responsibility that we have with keeping those knowledges and sharing those knowledges. I know as a, I guess, artist, as a practitioner myself, I had this view that all the art I create is not mine. I often get asked about intellectual property and ownership, and you own it. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm a steward of it. The art that I create is based off a huge base of our traditional arts practices. And I spend all day looking at our customary forms to create contemporary ones. But again, in a way, there's a responsibility that I have as a custodian. You know, I have a duty of care with that knowledge. And part of that, I think, is making sure that I look after it, and that also that I transmit that knowledge so that others can use it. And doing so, I think, in a way that is open, a little bit more open than some of our ancestors would have been, in terms of it was sometimes knowledge wasn't shared deliberately. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday around it wasn't shared deliberately because the thought was we won't give it to this person or that person because we don't know if they will look after it well or use it for their own means. But in doing that, one of the downsides has also been that so much of that knowledge has been lost. So I think for us, there's this little bit of a strange space of sharing a little bit more freely, still being cautious, but having a focus on the knowledge going forward, and as good a shape as we can keep it. So yeah, that's my last thought for today. But otherwise, yeah, really nice to be on the call and to meet some of the people I haven't met today too.
Should we leave it there then? Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks everybody for bringing their good hearts and good minds to the virtual square boxes. So